Hey, what's up, everyone? It is time for our weekly segment of Ask Mike. Our senior analyst, Mike Irwin, with me right now. Let's get started, as we always do, with a COVID-19 update.
Okay, I think we played 5 SEC games this past weekend. Only one was canceled. I think that was Vanderbilt, Georgia. The interesting thing is it really does look like we're going to make it to the end of the 10-game schedule. There's one more regular season weekend left, and that's going to involve Arkansas obviously playing Alabama in their last regular season game, and then Alabama and Florida will meet the next weekend for the SEC championship game. Each of them has their 10 games in, so any of those teams that still have an extra game to play will play that weekend, and that should round it all out. Now, basketball, Arkansas's basketball team is, what are they, 4-0 now or 5-0? 4-0. And undefeated. And they've had one game now postponed. That was the Tulsa game that was supposed to be played at Tulsa on Tuesday. Tulsa had one player test positive, and this shows how difficult this is going to be during basketball season, because you get one player on a team testing positive, but he's had contact with virtually everybody on that team. So through contact tracing, the rest of them pretty much are out, so you can't play a game. They've had to shut their program down. Probably now the rules have been relaxed on that quarantine. It's now down to 7 days if you test negative. So Tulsa looks like they're shut down for a week, and that kind of shows us what's going to happen during this football season. If you get a player testing positive on your team, you're probably going to lose, if you're in conference play, at least 2 games. Now in December, what we've seen is teams being much more creative. They're just going out and finding games. Arkansas Little Rock has offered to play Arkansas on Tuesday. I haven't heard if that's going to happen. We've heard that Eric Musselman may be looking at another opponent. But in the December schedule, you can do that. You can get creative. Once conference play starts, I think it's going to be more difficult. Again, one player testing positive on your team is probably going to wipe you out for a week. So what that means during the SEC schedule, said it last week, I think what they're going to have to do is move the NCAA tournament back a couple of weeks and allow 2 or 3 extra weeks to make up some of these games. But that's all speculation. We don't know what's really going to happen.
All right, let's get to our questions for this week. Our first one comes from Hogfat.
Hogfat, yep.
Oh, okay, sorry. Hogfat on here. Says, I understand you stated premise that Sam Pittman is bullish on bully ball. But why, when the plan of action is obviously non-feasible currently, why would Pittman and Briles persistently seek to force that scheme on a team that doesn't have the horsepower to execute it at this point in time?
Okay, that's in reference to the LSU game, in which you asked the question at halftime. And Sam Pittman said, we got to run the ball more, and we saw in that game they ran the ball more, they just didn't have success doing it. So why would you do that?
Yeah.
I think we saw a good example of why Sam Pittman likes that. All we had to do was get a quarterback change against Missouri, and look how everything changed. I got some numbers here. 292 yards rushing. That's by far and away Arkansas's best rushing numbers so far. They had 85 offensive snaps and 34 first downs. If they had had those kind of numbers against LSU, they would have won. So bully ball is not outlandish with this team. It may be all it needed was a quarterback change, and with the quarterback change, maybe some play calling differences. So I don't think Sam Pittman's off base on what he's trying to do. That's his philosophy. I think we saw in that Missouri game the future of the offense with what looks now to be their quarterback next year. And it's a much more balanced offense, using a lot more of the receivers. The play calling's different. So maybe it was just simply that. You change quarterbacks, and all of a sudden, Sam's bully ball doesn't look like it won't work with this team.
All right, our next question this week comes from Hammer Down, who says, a few weeks ago, you said you thought the coaches would or should go after a grad transfer QB. After KJ's performance against Missouri, though, do you still feel the same?
Well, it changes a lot, and I still can't speculate on what they're going to do, but he sure should surprise me. But I will defend myself a little bit, because in the past, 45 years of doing this at Arkansas, we've always seen practices, at least the first part of practices, and we don't see that now. I don't know if that's because of COVID or that's just Sam Pittman's philosophy. But once the season started, we didn't see KJ Jefferson. And when I looked at him in the preseason, I didn't see a lot of difference in those workouts in what I saw last year. Somebody was talking to me this morning about this and said, isn't it interesting the difference between the way that Kendall Briles developed Jefferson and what was done last year with Craddock? And I agree, it's just an amazing transformation. He did all kinds of things I didn't think he could do. I viewed him mostly as a runner that didn't throw the ball real well, didn't make good decisions, especially in difficult situations like on third down. We saw him in the Missouri game on like a third and, I don't know, 13 or 14, throw about a 45-yard pass across the middle. That was amazing to see that. So he certainly has changed the narrative on that. Still can't say they won't go after a grad transfer quarterback, but that's not what I'm hearing right now. And the one good thing that came out of that Missouri game is it sure looks a lot better next year for the offense.
Yeah, I think a lot of us were really impressed with KJ's performance. He looked really composed out there. All right, our next question comes from Austin Hog Fan on Hogville, who says, so who plays at QB this week against Alabama? Ooh, this is one interesting. If KJ, do you think he can play as well as he did against Missouri?
In his Monday Zoom, Sam Pittman said there's still no word on Felipe Frank's availability. I guess they're going to know more after the Monday workout. He might say something later in the week on it. I think his next Zoom is what, Thursday? Might say something about that, but honestly, why would he? Why wouldn't you keep Alabama in the dark, regardless of what you're going to do? Because as we've seen now, the offense, even the plays that are run are a bit different under Jefferson than they are under Felipe Franks. So why not make Alabama have to prepare for both? And that's what I expect. I think this is going to go down just like it did last week. We're going to have a game day decision. I'm not saying they won't still be looking at Franks maybe to see how he's doing with those ribs before the start of the game. But I don't think we're going to know anything till the game, and we'll see if I'm right about that.
You know what, I'd actually go with you on that one. I think we're probably going to have to wait and see on that one. But our next question comes from Blood Red Hog on Hogville, who says, has there been discussion about how to deal with Frank's injuries faked injuries during a game? An appropriate solution might be to require an injured player to sit out the remainder of that series before being allowed to return.
You know, it's just a difficult thing to deal with. Now, what we saw in that Missouri game was some of the silliest fake injuries I've ever seen. I mean, when you see a player get up, start walking around, then he looks at the bench, points at himself like me, and then just drops down like somebody shot him with a rifle from the stands, that was obvious.
Yeah.
If all fake injuries were like that, I think something would be done about it. But the problem is they're not. Now, what could you do? The best you could do is come up with a rule that says there's going to be an automatic replay on any kind of an injury where the clock is stopped.
Yeah.
Because they're going to come out and tend to this player whether he's hurt or not and make a show of it. Then he's going to be carted off the field or walked off. So that's going to require some time. So you could have the booth people look and see, okay, what allegedly happened to this guy? And if you see a replay like what we saw, you're going to know that's fake, and then maybe you could issue a penalty. But if you started doing that, all that would happen is coaches would get a lot better at saying to players, look, don't be obvious about this. Just, do something where you really look like you're hurt. Don't stand up and look around at the bench and point at yourself and then fall down. So I just can't see that this is ever going to get resolved, because there's always the danger that if you penalize a team for an injury that you say is fake and it turns out not to be fake, you're going to look pretty silly if you're the SEC. So it's one of those things, honestly, it's like, what's honorable among coaches? And I don't think this is honorable. And I would think that when they get together at the SEC meetings in Destin and start talking about this stuff, if I'm Sam Pittman, I get together with all the other coaches that don't like this, and we get the other coaches that do it in a room, which are mainly who? Malzahn does it, Drinkwitz does it. They're kind of proteges. They've worked together before. And just say, look, guys, cut it out. Yeah. This is trash. It's not the way football should be played.
It's actually what Sam Pittman said after the game. He said that that's not the integrity of the game to see that happen.
Sure.
So we'll see what happens. All right, our next question from this week is from PG Hog 1 on Hogville, who says, do the Hogs work on special teams at practice every day? Do you think that Coach Sam Pittman will change the special teams coach?
Well, I can only assume they do because, again, we don't see practice. Now, when we were up there and watching some of the preseason stuff, yes, they worked on it every day. Every team I've ever been around, they've worked on it. So I'm going to assume, yes, they work on it every day. Do I think there'll be a change? No, I don't. Even if Sam Pittman wanted to make a change there, and I don't think he does, there's no evidence of that, I don't think any coach is going to get fired this year because of the COVID revenue shortfalls. A guy like Scott Fountain, who's a special teams coordinator, has got a good salary, and it's probably guaranteed for 2 years. So you'd have to turn around and pay him next year not to coach, and then turn around and hire somebody to replace him.
Yep. They
don't have that kind of money. So I don't think anybody's going to be replaced on this staff, but I don't think Sam Pittman would do that anyway. Here's what I'm hearing. The problems on special teams are personnel related. It's just another example, like with the defense in the Missouri game, you've just got some gaps out there.
Yeah.
And they need better depth, they need to recruit better players, and they've got to put better players out there on special teams. And I think that's the way they solve this problem, not by firing a coach who's, I mean, some of these mistakes really, you ask yourself, why did that happen? Did they not work on this, that, and that? But the bottom line is, I think he's got some personnel issues out there with the people on special teams.
All right, our next question this week for you, Mike, comes from Said76 on Hogville, who says, do you know if we are recruiting any really good pass rushers? Every game we see the opposing QB sit in the pocket until he always finds a guy wide open right at the first down marker. As a fan, this is throw your remote at the TV frustrating to see week after week. Please tell me some help is on the way.
So I went to Otis Kirk, our recruiting guru, who knows a lot more about recruiting than I do, and I sort of ran that by him. And he said, well, they're actually looking at grad transfers in 3 areas. D-line is one of them, linebacker and secondary. They pretty much got their offense already down. I think what you'll see from here until signing day is trying to solve some problems on the defensive side. And again, as I mentioned earlier, you've got some good components scattered around that defense, but there are gaps. But the biggest issue is there's youth and a lack of depth.
Yeah.
And that's really what's caused that. I think what you may see is they add a grad transfer along the D-line and they develop some of those younger players that had to play in that LSU game because of COVID and develop them next spring, which didn't happen this year. We didn't get any spring development of this new defense that they're running. So you run all those guys through the spring and you really work those younger guys. I think you'll see more depth on the defense next year. I think you'll see some holes plugged. I think they'll definitely look at that one cornerback spot and see what they can do to shore that up. Otis also says they're really going after speed in the secondary. They want guys that have the speed to cover those receivers and not get beat deep and maybe not get sucked off their feet and have a guy curl inside and get the first down either. So I think you're going to see this defense improve through recruiting, but also through work next year in spring football.
All right, our next question for you, Mike, comes from Hallman24 on Hogville, who says, if Florida beats Alabama and Clemson beats Notre Dame, all 4 would be 10-1. Would they meet up again in the playoff games?
You know, all I can say is that's certainly a possibility, and if it happens, you would expect something like, you know, Alabama plays Notre Dame, Clemson plays Florida, so you don't repeat those teams playing each other back-to-back weekends. And that would be a good Final Four. The problem is you got Ohio State sitting there at 6-0. What do you do with Ohio State? Well, to me, I do nothing with them, but I don't make the decision. I don't have any respect for the Big Ten and the way they handled this situation. They sat back, said, we're not playing football. They waited till the SEC got about a month into the season and went, whoops, we made a mistake. Let's start playing. And so you're going to base somebody being undefeated on 6 or 7 games. You got a Pac-12 team, USC, that's 7-0, and you're going to stick one of them in the playoffs because what? Because they're undefeated? Well, they didn't play a full 10-game schedule. So here's what I think is going to happen. I think Alabama is going to beat Florida, and the reason I say that is both of those teams, I think Florida may be a little bit better offensively than Alabama, but there's no comparison between the defense on those two teams.
Yeah.
And I think Alabama is going to beat Florida. That's going to give Florida 2 losses. That's going to knock them out, and Ohio State is going to sneak into that 4th spot that way. But I don't like it. I think you ought to have 10 games to be eligible, but that's not in the parameters right now. It's just, why reward a conference that sat around with its nose up in the air saying we can't play and then went, whoops, I guess we can, and then you don't play a full schedule, but your team gets into the national championship playoff. Don't like it.
Well, that's a good point, though, Mike. Pork Soda has our next question and wants to know, what happened to the defense against Missouri? Are they wearing down at the end of a long, grinding SEC season? Was Odom's scheme exposed, or some other explanation for it?
I do think that teams started to adjust to what he did, which is why he had more success early than late. There may be some wearing down. I think one of the things that happened is when you had that COVID week and you had all those young guys out there, that obviously was the difference in that game. But then you had all those people sit out, and I know they were still sort of working out during that period, but they don't play for 2 weeks, and then you stick them out there and against Missouri, and maybe it's not what it should have been. So I think that was part of it. I also think losing Grant Morgan in the 3rd quarter, if you really go back and look at that game, Arkansas had seized all the momentum in the 3rd quarter. Arkansas's defense was starting to stop Missouri. Arkansas's offense was scoring. They got 2 touchdown lead early in the 4th quarter, and it looked like to me 2 things happened. The defense relaxed. We're up 2 touchdowns. We've been stopping these guys. And it looked like Missouri said to themselves, hey, this is Arkansas. We always beat these guys. We're not going to let them beat us. And they just sucked it up, and Arkansas wasn't ready for it. That one play was, I think, a 1-play scoring drive. Then they come back and score quickly again, and from that point on, you can't stop them. And that's called losing momentum. But it's really kind of odd, because if you look at what was happening on the offensive side of the ball, it was just the opposite. Those guys refused to quit. I mean, you look at that last drive in which they took a 1-point lead. That may have been the best drive of the entire season. They just worked and did everything they could to make it happen. They showed poise. They go down there, they score. They got a little bit lucky on the 2-point conversion, but they've got the 1-point lead. And then that defense just runs up the white flag. Now, I have to tell you, I wouldn't want to be one of those defensive guys on the offseason. It's not that the guys on the offensive side are going to say anything. You're just going to walk around from now until next spring football at least knowing what you did. And how do you make up for it? That's embarrassing, and that wears on players, and it makes them say to themselves, we can't do that anymore. So I think that game might end up being a motivation down the road for these defenses moving forward, but that's my assessment of what happened in that game.
I do think losing Grant Morgan had a big factor in all that.
Sure, he's your leader out there.
Yeah, exactly.
Keeps everything organized.
Yeah. Our next question is from Parallax Pig, who wants to know, Will Muschamp and Derek Mason are gone. Does Auburn have $21 million worth of reasons to get rid of Gus?
I don't know about the reasons, but I don't think it's going to happen, and I've talked about this before. Gus Malzahn's got an ally in the president at Auburn. There's kind of a two camp thing going on there. These boosters over here that want Gus gone. The guy running the university says, nah, we like him. That's why he got that 7-year, $49 million contract or whatever it is, and I think they'd owe him more than $21 million if they fired him at the end of this year. So there's 2 things there. I don't think with COVID even Auburn could afford that. And number 2, he's got an ally, a pretty strong ally. And as long as you got that school president in place, I think they'd honestly almost have to fire that guy, sort of like we saw Jeff Long getting fired, and then they fired Brett Bielema.
Yeah.
I think you might have to see the president of the school get fired before they would fire Gus Malzahn. I just don't think it's going to happen this year. Jeez. Maybe next year.
Yeah. All right. Our next question is from JHicks3636, who wants to know, any thoughts or insight on the Bielema Foundation lawsuit that you can or will share?
The only thing I've seen lately is, and I think some of you may have seen this, is that Brett Bielema acknowledged that he's been looking at some head coaching jobs on the college level again. I think Southern Miss was a job he might have been up for. I haven't heard anything lately on that. If he takes a job with a reasonably good salary, I think he might be more likely to settle. I've said all along, I think this is a settlement thing. I think Arkansas stepped out there and said, we're not paying you. And they stopped paying him. And that's why he's suing. You say, wait a minute, you owe me this. And you get your lawyers together and they argue, and then maybe the judge gets you two together and says, this is the way it's looking. And then maybe you get together and Arkansas says, okay, we'll pay you this much. And Bielema says, I don't know. And his lawyer says, you probably should take it. And then they come up with some sort of settlement. I don't think this is going to be a one way or other way. He gets it all or Arkansas doesn't pay him anything. And again, I think some of it may be if he gets a head coaching job and he's making somewhere around $1 million, $1.5 million a year or more, then that takes a lot of pressure for him off what he has to get from Arkansas.
Okay, just a few more questions for you, Mike. Our next one comes from Pig's Feet, who wants to know, when the vaccine becomes available, do you foresee athletes, pro and college, being at the front of those receiving it? And would that take care of all COVID concerns in sports from that point on?
Well, they certainly won't be at the front. And by the way, the vaccine started being distributed in I think, Great Britain over the weekend. That's really good news. And the Pfizer vaccine starts getting distributed in this country on this weekend. So it's very quickly happening now. But it's not going to athletes first, I promise you. The first people that are going to get it are doctors, nurses, frontline medical people that deal with COVID patients, and elderly people in nursing homes. They are the ones that are going to get it first. So that would be the December into January batch. Then maybe in January you see patients or people that have these underlying medical conditions. These are the people that are more likely to get really sick if they get COVID. And that might end up being something where the doctors decide that. Yes, you've got this underlying condition. I'm worried about you. Yes, I decide that you get the vaccine. So that's the second group. I've read some things over the weekend that athletes may be included in the third group, and that would come sometime around March or April. And the idea being that what they do does put them in a position to get COVID because they're all together, they're around each other, it's hard to socially distance. You know, they kind of walk through a minefield on doing this, so there might be some sort of attitude of, okay, you guys are next, and that would probably apply to professional athletes, amateur athletes, maybe even high school athletes. So they would be maybe in the third group that gets it. Will that really stop the COVID problems in sports? Well, if it's what they say it is. I mean, both of the vaccines, the Moderna or however you say that, and the Pfizer vaccine, they're both around 95% effective in testing. So if that turns out to be true, I think you've pretty much eliminated COVID as a problem in sports, because I promise you these schools are going to vaccinate all of these athletes. And once they're vaccinated, they don't transmit it anymore. They can't get it, at least you might have to get a vaccination every year, but it's going to knock it out among the athletes, so it's going to eliminate this crazy stuff of we have to cancel a game. Yep. Now, how does it affect the fans? Well, fans probably can't, as an entire group, can't expect relief probably until the summer. That's when I'm hearing that the vaccination will be widely available to everybody. But here's the issue. Who goes to football games? A lot of these people are conservative. And conservative people, based on what I read on the internet, don't like the idea of a vaccine. So you're going to have a lot of football fans and fans of basketball and college sports and even pro sports. You're going to have these people have to make some decisions. Because I think what they're going to do is, if you want to have a full stadium and you're the University of Arkansas, you're going to have to tell your governor, okay, we will require a vaccination card for you to come to our games. And I've now seen a story that said, yes, when you get the vaccine, when you get vaccinated, they will give you a card which you carry around in your wallet or your purse, and you may be required to show it. So this may be required in order to go to a football game next fall, because Arkansas wants a full stadium. Okay, what happens if a bunch of those people say two things? Well, I kind of sat and watched on TV this year and it wasn't that bad, and I don't want the vaccine, so nah, I'm just not going to games this year. Or I may not go to any more of them, may just start watching on TV. Then what's the long-term effect? You may see a school like Alabama which has a regular attendance of 101,000 at their games, that attendance might drop to around 90. At Arkansas, it might go from a possible 76,000 for a big game down to 65. That creates a revenue shortfall that long-term schools are going to have to deal with. So is all of this going to happen? I got no idea, but it is stuff that's kind of floating around out there. You just don't know how many of people are willing to take this vaccine in order to be able to go to a sporting event next fall.
All right, we've got one more question. It's a bit odd. It's kind of my favorite, though. Just out of curiosity, Tyro3 wants to know, what is Connor Vanover's shoe size?
Okay, believe it or not, I cannot just pick up a phone and call Connor. I couldn't pick up a phone and call Coach Muss. The only time we're able to talk to athletes or coaches is in these Zooms. It used to be press conferences. Right now, these Zooms have taken the place of press conferences. I promise you, there's nobody in the media that's going to get in one of these Zooms and ask for Connor Vanover's shoe size. So that was out.
Yeah.
So then I started asking myself, well, how else can I find out? Well, Alyssa Orange knows all of these people kind of surrounding the basketball program. She knows a lot of people. So okay. So I asked her. She said, first of all, when she started asking around, she got a lot of weird responses like, why do you want to know? You know, what's going on with that? So she said that she never got an absolute 100% answer. The best she could do is most people seem to think that he wears somewhere between a 17 and an 18 shoe size, so maybe it will remain a mystery. I'm not asking that question in a Zoom.
It is kind of entertaining, though.
Yes,
All right. Well, that's going to do it for this week's episode of Ask Mike for Mike Irwin. I'm Tara Talmadge, guys. Thanks for watching. We'll see you back here next week.